Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Public Safety and Government Operations Committee meeting. In attendance today, we've got, of course, myself, Chair of the committee, representing the 4th District. I see Councilman Burnett, representing the 8th District. I see Councilman Glover, representing the 13th District. Councilwoman Porter, representing the 10th District. I think that's all we have for members of the committee at the moment. And then we also have Councilman Ryan Dorsey, representing the 3rd District, visiting today. For members of the Office of the President, do I have Nikki Thompson on the line?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Nikki. Matt Stegman? And Aaron Graffenright? Okay, and representing the Mayor's Office, do I have Natasha on the line?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Natasha. And Nina Demolis?
Just me today.
All right. Excellent. So this afternoon, the committee will have a hearing for Bill 21-0157, limiting the range of city-owned take-home vehicles for the purpose of solely allowing a user of a city-owned take-home vehicle to drive the vehicle within the confines of Baltimore City and authorizing city agencies to adopt implementing rules and regulations. This bill was introduced on September 20th, 2021, and it was sponsored by Councilmember Ryan Dorsey. And I'm going to turn it over to the sponsor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the members of the committee for all being here today, and to all the agency representatives in attendance. I am thankful for the work. I guess the first thing I'll say is the work that I've been able to do with the mayor's office, with Deputy Mayor Sonny Schnitzer, who I understand unfortunately couldn't be here for the hearing today, as well as the Chief Administrator's Office, and also to Chi-Chi and DGS for the work that I know that they've already done in the past to kind of dig in on this and dig into this subject. Look, it takes a toll on our fleet to have city-owned vehicles driven excessive distances just for basic commuting purposes. That is not really something that happens generally in other sectors of work. Most of the world does not just get a vehicle handed to them to drive to and from work, no matter how far away they live, or even within constraints that may be long distances away. And that does happen here with city employees. We have a number of city employees who are assigned vehicles that they drive just to and from work every day for no express need or purpose, except that it's nice for them to be able to drive somebody's vehicle that's not their own. You know, so for me, this bill originates from kind of a basic common sense that we should have some reasonable standards here. And in plenty of other jurisdictions, you know, there are reasonable limitations placed on those take-home vehicles that are assigned for specific purposes. As drafted, the original first reader copy of this bill is incredibly brief. It just says no take-home vehicles go to homes outside of the city. Obviously, that's kind of a baseline that would require certain exceptions. And it is those exceptions specifically that I have been working with Deputy Mayor Schnitzer and Government Relations and the Chief Administrator's Office on. And there are some amendments that were drafted by DLR at the request of the CAO that are in the bill file at this point, and that should be available to committee members. I would say we are still working on that. We are still in a back and forth conversation about how to tweak them and make them even better, and to further address the variety of concerns that have come up in our conversations. So I'm certainly happy to answer any questions related to those amendments or the conversation that we've had about them. I am available to answer kind of questions across the board about this bill. I am here not as a committee member, but as a sponsor of this bill, but available to all the committee members to discuss the bill, its intent, and the way I see this possibly going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me the opportunity to introduce this bill today. Thank you for hearing it.
Thank you, Councilman Dorsey. And I want to acknowledge Councilman Ramos has joined the meeting. And Councilman Cohen is an excused absence for today. All right, with that, we're going to jump into agency reports. Please state your name for the record as you give your report. We're going to start off with the fire department. Do we have someone from the fire department?
Mr. Chair, I don't believe we have someone from the fire department on, but the agencies are deferring to the CAO's office on this matter.
Okay, so I will go through each one, and if there is someone, please stand by your report. If not, then we'll eventually, of course, get to the administrator's office. So next up is the Department of Public Works. All right, no one from the Department of Public Works.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon,
Oh, how's it going, Marcia?
Chair. I'm sorry, a little slow today.
All good.
I'm Marcia Collins. I'm representing the Department of Public Works in this hearing. We do stand by our report. We did want to point out that because there are a number of responsibilities and duties we perform outside of the city, specifically the regional nature of our water and wastewater facilities, that creates an issue for us as the bill is currently written. I understand that our concerns are embodied in the CAO's office amendments, so we defer to the CAO's office, and I'll be here for the entire hearing in case you should have any specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia. Next up, we've got the administrator's office.
Chairman Conway, thank you very much. Want to make sure you can hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Very good. Let me say first, I appreciate that we've been able to work so very closely with the councilman on this legislation. I do want to read aloud the recommendations, if you will, that we have outlined as a response. And I'm happy to sort of answer questions. There are a few bullets here, and I'll summarize as best as I can. We have recommended that we extend the effective date of the legislation to 240 days to allow for the reimbursement process for those employees that are applicable. We have asked that exceptions be made for employees who work outside the city limits, which is essentially was just mentioned by DPW in particular. We are also asking that we make exceptions for travel required while on duty, and that is to say meetings outside of the jurisdiction, mutual aid agreements, etc. We are asking for exceptions for employees who are in an on-call status, that is to say duty officers who live within 30 miles of the city. We're asking for personnel contracts to be grandfathered in and not be included in the legislation. We're also asking that we grandfather existing leases for vehicles through either appointments that came through appointments to the position. And we are also finally asking that for some flexibility in that we have as a government, and my office in particular, that we have the ability to make exceptions that are only authorized by me directly. That is to say, some agility as a government when the need arises. I'll stop there and say again, I've really appreciated and personally appreciated Councilman Dorsey's willingness to continue talking with us and working with us. Deputy Mayor Sonny Snitzer has been very actively involved in this process and meeting with agencies to provide the content in this report. So I'm happy to kind of answer questions as we go. Thank you again, Chairman.
Thank you, Administrator Shorter. Next up, we've got the Law Department.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, Elena DePietro from the Law Department. Given the extent of the activity surrounding the discussions between the administration and the sponsor and the number of amendments that are flying around, we thought it was prudent to not submit a report at this time and wait until there's a version of the bill that is likely to move forward. So we reserve our opinion until that time.
Okay, thank you, Elena. Next, we've got the Department of Finance.
Good afternoon, Mara James, Legislative Engagement Lead for the Department of Finance. We stand by our report and defer to the CAO.
Thank you, Mara. Next, we've got the Department of General Services.
Chairman Conway. This is Chichi Nyaga-Nash, Director of the Department of General Services. We are also deferring to the Office of the City Administrator, standing by our report.
Thank you, Chichi. Next up, we've got the Department of Human Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quentin Herbert, Director of the Department of Human Resources. We stand by our report and defer to the Office of the CAO.
Thank you, Director Herbert. Next, we got the Police Department.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Michelle Wurzberger. I am Director of Government Affairs for the Baltimore Police Department. We stand by our report and we defer to the CAO. That said, we do have a number of team members who are on this call and poised to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Michelle. And next up, we've got the Department of Housing and Community Development.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Stephanie Murdoch, Legislative Liaison for DHCD. I'm joined here today by Deputy Commissioner of Code Enforcement and Emergency Operations, Eric Booker. Although not originally assigned this legislation, we did provide a bill report detailing our concerns about the bill. These concerns were primarily around the need for DHCD's Emergency Operations section to utilize take-home vehicles to conduct their work. This personnel assists with the relocation of residents across the city in times of need. For instance, instances where they may be responding to a fire, a gas leak, or a building in danger of collapse. As written, DHCD would oppose this legislation. However, we would be in support of the administrator's amendments if they were to be adopted, which would allow on-call employees to still retain the ability to use take-home vehicles. So not to belabor the point, but we are here in support of the administrator's amendments, and we stand by to answer any questions.
Thank you, Stephanie. All right, I'm going to open up the floor to questions from the committee and any other council members. Actually, in fact, I'll open up the floor to Councilman Dorsey, given it's his bill, if he's got any particular questions that he'd like to ask.
Mr. Chair, I'm in a pretty thorough conversation with the city administrator's office, the deputy mayor's office, and kind of via them, the other various agencies and their concerns, specifically addressing things like what Marcia brought up on behalf of DPW. It was, even early in my initial conversations with Deputy Mayor Schnitzer, it was, my suggestion that we create a certain carve out, specifically looking at an entity like the environmental police. They have a very unique role, very unique situation where while they are a city employee, the jurisdiction in which they operate is not defined as the city of Baltimore. The jurisdiction that they are employed to work in is the watershed. And so, you know, as a similar corollary to the concept of if you live in the city, you may be eligible to have a take-home vehicle within the city. The corollary to that would be if you live within the watershed, that is the place that you serve, then you may be eligible for a take-home vehicle to work within that watershed. And so those are the kind of conversations that we're having to make sure that exemptions to the general rule are not overly broad. And that, you know, as the chief administrator mentioned, and what is addressed in their proposed amendments is, you know, obviously we have to honor existing contracts. You know, we're not here to try to meddle in contractual, you know, matters that are settled by contractual law. But, you know, we want to have a strong understanding of who exactly, you know, what contracts we actually have for which employees and other things like, you know, what do we mean when we talk about duty officers?
Councilman Dorkin, I don't want to cut you off as much as if there's a question you want to get to, we can ask those questions.
No, I just want to be clear. There's a whole, as Elena noted, there's a wide range of things that we're in conversation about. And so I appreciate you just taking this time for the other committee members to ask whatever may be on their mind of me or anybody else.
Awesome. Thank you, Councilman Dorsey. And I just want to know, we're not going to dig into the proposed amendments so much today. We'll actually have the opportunity to do that in a later work session. So just want to put that on the table for members of the committee. With that, are there any questions about the bill? Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues, and thank you, Councilman, for bringing this issue. I think it's something that has come up in some of our committee meetings relative to some of the work and investigation and understanding that we're trying to have related to the fire department. So I guess this question comes to city administrator. I'm curious about, I guess part of this issue isn't just the use of take-home vehicles, but maybe even the larger discussion around employees that are not living in the city. And wondered if there's been some conversations around, you know, does this policy incentivize people to work for us but not live in the city? And wondering how that is kind of playing out in your mind as we're working through this particular bill.
Yes, thank you, Councilwoman Ramos. I appreciate the question. I do, because we were not prepared to talk about the statistics associated with the number of employees within our workforce that live in the city versus the number that do not. Let me say that the statistics that I know, especially from agencies like DPW, we have a pretty significant number of our workforce that live in the city. In the case of DPW, upwards of 97, 98% of the DPW workforce live in Washington, in the city. So that said, if Director Herbert has statistics on the number of employees, I'm happy to kind of defer to him. Otherwise, I'll say that most of the amendments that we have laid out as a reaction to the legislation really revolve around us conducting government business. And what we don't want to do is put our employees in a position, and I, again, appreciate very much Councilman Dorsey's willingness to continue to talk through these issues. We don't want to put our employees in a position where they can't conduct government business, and that includes conferences and other professional training events that are in and around this region. And so that ultimately is where we want to get to. In the case of reimbursing employees and asking for some period of time to allow for the legislation to take effect, this is for tax purpose reasons. We are taking taxes out of employees' pay, and we want to make sure that works its way through in fairness to our employees. So no, that doesn't directly answer the question, but I hope it partially does, and I'm happy to kind of talk with you offline if needed about the broader question of recruitment and retention of our workforce.
Yeah, I think to me, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair, certainly we have to make exemptions for environmental police and DPW who works at our water facilities outside of the city. That makes total sense. It's just a matter of, I just don't want us to be incentivizing people to not live in the city and still work for the city. And so I think it sounds like those conversations are mostly around the issues of, obviously people being able to do their jobs, respond quickly to emergencies, which is extremely important. So just wanted to have everybody sort of keep that in mind. But that was my only question. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just by way of reaction, Chairman, I will say I agree, Councilwoman, and I would also say that we don't want to penalize our employees for in terms of not being able to get back into the city to do their jobs. And so one of the amendments that speaks to on-duty status and the need to make sure that employees who are on call with us have the ability to get back into the city. I don't necessarily see that as an incentive to live outside the city. I do and would see it as a disincentive to maintain on-call status, and that we are, like many local governments around the country, are in a position right now where we are really wanting to make sure that our organization is one that is competitive and where we can get the best and brightest public administrators and public servants. And so if we want to be able to say to our employees, we need you on an on-call status, we need you to pick up the phone and be able to get to your job quickly, then we have to be able to, as an organization, give them the tools to do that. And so that's, as we are talking to the councilman about our amendments and working with him over the coming days and weeks, that will certainly be a focus point for us and a lens that we are sort of thinking through, or I should say looking through in terms of the conversations.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Mr. Chair, I remembered I had one last question. The one thing that was concerning in one of our hearings with the fire department was whether or not when someone has a take-home vehicle and is on call, if they are allowed to be using it for other things while they're waiting to whether or not be on call, like take the children to school, go to the grocery store, those kinds of things. Are those also things that you're interested in, particularly if there's a child in the car, whether that ends up being a liability issue?
I'm sorry, Councilwoman, was that a question for me or for the chairman?
That was for you, sir. I'm sorry.
Okay. I think our rules around the use of government vehicles are clear, and that all our employees across the entire organization are clear that the government vehicle, even if taken home, can only be used for government purposes. So children should not be transported. Non-government employees should not be transported. Those kinds of personal uses are not permitted in government vehicles, no matter whether they are being taken home or not.
Thank you for clarifying that policy. Thank you, City Administrator Shorter. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Ramos. I have a question myself as well, and this is a question to the sponsor, and I guess for CAO Shorter. Have we seen other municipalities take on a policy like this, and how has it worked there? Has it been a challenge thereafter? Like, have we seen this somewhere else?
Yeah, there are, I'm sorry, I'll just ask, Mr. CEO, do you have a response to this? Because I can just kind of give a little bit of information here.
I have not personally done the research and wouldn't want to speak out of turn. So that's certainly part of the work that we'll do after the hearing today, and with Councilman Dorsey, we'll look at certainly jurisdictions in the region as well as further out to see if there are any examples of best practice that we could take from.
So I'll just, thank you. Yeah, we'll do a little bit more work on this to be able to cite more jurisdictions, but suffice to say, there are plenty of other examples, some of which were highlighted in the Inspector General's office report a couple of months ago on the fire department's take-home vehicles, citing kind of inconsistency with their departmental policy and other jurisdictions' departmental policies. For example, citing a shorter distance as a more typical standard for those who do have take-home vehicles outside of the jurisdiction that they're there to, that they serve. And to think about this, a couple of other parameters. But I think that there are examples of other kind of tighter constraints on the conditions under which a person can take home a specific vehicle. Again, in the conversations that we've had, me and Deputy Mayor Schnitzer, the kind of top concern is cases where somebody has a specific vehicle, and the Chief Administrator also talked about this, the idea of duty officers, people who are on call at a very specific time for a very specific purpose, and particularly when they are assigned a very specific vehicle that is specially outfitted and transports particular types of materials in order to achieve a specialized task. Those kind of parameters are, they certainly do exist elsewhere. And as well as, I think, like this bill and the amendments are seeking to achieve reasonable standards, right? It's unreasonable to say a person is on call and therefore needs to be able to respond to an emergency when the distance that they would have to travel means that they would be the last person on the scene every single time. If you're not going to be able to show up to an emergency in order to actually provide tangible benefits to the scene before anybody else, then you might as well be driving your own vehicle to that scene, because it's going to take you an hour or whatever to get there. So those kind of like reasonable standards and expectations do exist elsewhere, and we will pull some examples together before our next hearing.
Thank you, Councilman. Any additional questions from any members? All right, seeing no questions, no hands up. We're going to move in.
I do, Mr. Chair.
Councilman Burnett.
Sorry, I was like getting up. It was just a quick question for the CAO. In your agency report, and I know we're not getting too far into amendments, so don't really want to, but the background section, one of the exceptions that was asked for it just says general exceptions. Can you describe what that means, or what that means to you, what that could look like?
Yeah, it just means flexibility. I think as a government, and by that I mean as a government and representing the government, we are constantly in the recruitment mode. I wouldn't want to be in a position where we are saying to a potential executive or a potential commissioner or candidate for employment that we do not have the flexibility at all to negotiate a new contract that does not currently exist. So some of the amendments speak to current contracts being grandfathered. They do not speak to new employment contracts and would want, just by way of example, the agility, flexibility to enter into new employment agreements that allow for some use of government vehicles outside of the city.
Okay. I mean, I know we're going to talk about these at length more, so I'll just leave it there. I wasn't sure what that meant, but I would say, I guess, for future discussions, if we could get a little bit more clarity. I would just hate to have what could be, obviously not accusing you of this, but sort of a loophole or some sort of lack of clarity and vagueness in the policy that doesn't really hit on the intent of what the sponsor is looking to accomplish. But I know we're going to do a deeper dive, so I just wanted to throw it out there. I mean,
Yes.
y'all have a response, but yeah.
Yeah, just by way of reaction, in allowing the government to still have flexibility, I don't think is ambiguous. If we, for example, moved on legislation that did not allow for that and for flexibility, then what that would mean is that we would essentially be coming back to this body, or that we would not have the ability to enter into new employment agreements. And that's just really one example. And am happy to kind of, as we talk with Councilman Dorsey, come back with other examples of why that flexibility would be needed and what benefit it would bring from an administrative perspective. So, happy to sort of talk through it going forward. But I wanted to make sure I sort of jumped in on that piece.
Okay. Yeah, I'll look forward to additional dialogue. I don't want to take up too much more time on that. Thank you.
Thank you both. All right. Any other questions before we head to public testimony? All right. Seeing no further questions, we'll now take public testimony. And we're going to get the instructions up there in a moment. So the committee staff will coordinate public testimony. Please be patient. If you're connecting online, please use the raise hand function to indicate that you wish to testify. That's going to be located at the bottom right of your screen if you're using a computer. Each speaker must state their name prior to speaking for the record. Users who call in and cannot be identified by name will be unmuted one by one. And if you do not wish to testify, please say so when you are unmuted. Attendees will hear two beeps when they are unmuted. State your name at the beginning of your testimony, of course. And if you are inaudible, you may be directed to call back or to provide testimony in the chat function. So with that, once again, please use the raise hand function at the bottom right of the WebEx application. At the moment, I do not see any testimony and no callers. All right, so with that, we're actually going to put this bill in recess. Any closing statements from sponsor Councilman Dorsey before we wrap up?
I'm good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All right, that bill's in recess, and we're going to move on to our next bill.